What if I told you there's a Gruul commander that never runs out of gas, rewards you with free wolves whenever you play anything from Exile, and completely overwhelms the table without ever having to cast a dedicated token spell? Faldorn Wolf Herald. For 3 mana in Gruul colors we get this very angry looking lady accompanied by her 2 cute and friendly little pet wolves. Now Faldorn is a very unique commander that only cares about one thing: playing cards from Exile. Because whenever we either cast a spell or play a land straight from Exile, she will generate us a 2/2 wolf token. And what makes her this interesting is that normally one of Gruul's biggest weaknesses is just simply running out of gas. Usually you'll just empty your hand, then top deck 1 card every turn and your deck just simply slows down. But Faldorn completely solves that problem in a different way. Instead of just trying to draw a ton of cards, this deck is filled with impulse draw effects that will allow us to exile the top cards from our library and play them straight from there. And every card we manage to play this way doesn't only generate value by itself, it will also generate us an additional 2/2 wolf token. Now there are quite a few other commanders that also reward you whenever you cast from Exile, like for example an Iraxa or the newly spoiled Nico Minoru. But what I really like about Faldorn is that she doesn't only care about spells, she'll also trigger whenever we play any land from Exile. Which means if our impulse drawing only finds lands, we're still perfectly good to go. We can simply make our land drop straight from Exile, continue developing our mana while even growing our board whenever we do so. Faldorn really makes any impulse draw effect we play feel worthwhile, even if we don't hit straight gas. Now while obviously Faldorn is an excellent payoff for this type of deck, she's also a really solid enabler. Because for just 1 mana, tapping her and discarding a card, we get to exile the top card of our library and we get to play it until the end of turn. So even before doing anything else during our turn, we can just pitch one of our weaker cards we don't need or any sort of excess land into our graveyard. And Faldorn will then provide us with a new card to cast, and whenever we do so, she will even generate us one of those wolves in the process. Basically helping us fuel the entire strategy she's asking us to build around. Now this deck honestly plays like some sort of a Gruul version of Storm, except instead of trying to cast 20 spells in a single turn, we're just trying to get as many cards as we can into Exile, then cast them from there and get rewarded every time we do so. We'll spend the early game just accelerating our mana because this deck is incredibly mana hungry, then we'll start deploying powerful Exile engines that will allow us to get like 2 or 3 cards into Exile every single turn. Once all of these engines are online, it's finally time for Faldorn to hit the battlefield and start generating our pack of wolf tokens. And once we've established our massive wolf army, it's time to start turning those tokens into an actual game win. And let me tell you, this really is one of the most synergistic decks that I've ever put together. For this build, I decided to go entirely budgetless to just be able to showcase how explosive and how strong Faldorn can get. But don't worry if that's outside of your budget, because throughout the video I will be pointing out about 15 budget alternatives that do reduce the cost of this deck by a huge amount. If you do want to see the complete list of specific budget swaps, I did include it over in the Moxfield primer. As I do in all my videos, I will be going over every single card in the deck and explaining why I decided to include it. This video is divided up into 6 categories: the acceleration, getting stuff into Exile, going for the win, support, protection and interaction, and the lands. And let's start this video off by taking a look at our acceleration section, because before we can start casting from Exile and flooding the battlefield with wolves, there's one very specific problem we should tackle first: mana. We just want to be able to cast multiple spells from Exile every single turn, and we do need a ton of resources for that. And because of that, we're running a very healthy amount of acceleration, just to make sure we can start popping off once our Exile engines are on the battlefield. Studious first here. A 1 mana bear wizard that will enter the battlefield prepared. And for as long as this creature is prepared, we get to cast the rampant part growth of this card, which will cost us 2 mana and allow us to fetch a basic land from our deck and put it onto the battlefield tapped. Now the main reason this card is included is because the prepare mechanic has a really cool synergy with Faldorn, because whenever you use its ability it will create a copy of Rampant Growth, and whenever you do decide to cast it, it does count as casting from Exile, both giving us access to a creature body that we can use later in the game as a chump blocker, some really solid early game acceleration, and a way to trigger Faldorn and generate a wolf while also triggering all of the other cast from Exile synergies that we are playing in the deck. Birds of Paradise and Delighted Halfling. Both of these creatures are 1-drop mana dorks we can tap to add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool, just allowing us to accelerate our mana from as early as turn 1. And while obviously these things do enable us to play our commander from as early as turn 2, usually that isn't the thing you want to do in this deck, because it will make it really easy for your opponents to actually remove her, and if we don't have any Exile engines on the battlefield yet, she won't really do all that much. So usually it's a better idea to use these early game acceleration tools to just ramp out your Exile engines and then drop Faldorn on a later turn once your board is established. And while Delighted Halfling is an excellent card that will even prevent your commander from being countered, if you don't want to spend a budget on this card, you can totally replace it with an Elvish Mystic, which does exactly the same job. Exploration, a 1 mana enchantment that will allow you to make an additional land drop during your turn. And no matter what sort of impulse draw deck that you're playing, having the access to additional land drops is absolutely mandatory. Because once you have a couple of your Exile engines on the battlefield, you will always be exiling a bunch of additional lands. And without a card like Exploration, most of the exiled lands will just be wasted forever and you won't have access to them anymore. A card like this will just reduce the chances that any of your lands go to waste, while at the same time also accelerating your mana, because you will always have a ton of lands available in Exile thanks to all of the impulse drawing that we'll be doing. Now while Exploration is a really efficient card, it does come with quite a hefty price tag, and a good budget alternative is an Exploration Broodship, which is a 1 mana spacecraft with the station mechanic, meaning we can tap any of our creatures to add charge counters on it equal to the power of the creature we tapped. Once it gets to 3 charge counters, it has exactly the same effect as Exploration, allowing us to play an additional land, and if you do manage to get it to its final stage, which happens at 8 or more charge counters, it even gives you access to an additional recursion tool that will allow you to recast permanent cards from your graveyard by sacrificing a land. A really awesome card for this type of deck, especially due to the fact that it will be really easy to station up with all of our wolf tokens, but I just really like how Exploration can be dropped on turn 1 and you never have to worry about it anymore. Arbor Elf, a 1 mana creature you can tap to untap target forest. And this thing has exactly the same function as a Birds of Paradise and a Delighted Halfling, just allowing us to accelerate our mana from turn 1 by 1 point. Especially due to the fact that we're just a 2-color deck and we are playing a bunch of lands that actually have the forest typing, so we'll always have targets for its ability. Now the main reason why this card is included is due to its synergy with the next 2 cards, Utopia Sprawl and Wild Growth. Both of these are 1 mana enchantments we can hook up to any of our lands, and whenever we now tap that land for mana, we get to add 2 to our mana pool instead, just giving us additional tools to start accelerating from as early as turn 1, making sure we can get our Exile engines out 1 turn earlier, while at the same time also having a really crazy synergy with Arbor Elf, because once you did get these hooked up to a land, you can just tap it for 2 mana, then untap it with the Arbor Elf, and you will be able to tap it to add another 2 mana to your mana pool, making 1 single land produce you 4 mana. Goblin Anarchomancer, a 2-drop creature that will reduce the cost of any red or green spell that we cast by 1 generic mana. And this little dude is just the perfect fit for the type of storm gameplay we're going for in this deck, because unlike all of the previous cards, it won't just give you a one-time acceleration effect, it will apply to any spell you cast during a turn. So once you have a couple of Exile engines on the battlefield and you do manage to impulse draw like 5 cards into Exile, this little goblin's cost reduction will apply to all of them, and it will be really easy to make sure none of those cards go to waste and you will be able to cast all of them, which will make it really easy to get a ton of wolves out of Faldorn and get a ton of cast from Exile triggers for all of our other effects you're about to see later. Party Thrasher, the first Cast from Exile synergy card in the deck, and it is a really crazy one. It's a 2-mana, 1/4 lizard wizard that will give all non-creature spells you cast from Exile the Convoke mechanic, meaning that whenever you cast them you can tap any of your creatures to help pay for their mana cost. And let me tell you, this thing is just absolutely ridiculous when combined with the Wolf tokens that Faldorn will generate us. Once you have this thing on the battlefield and a reliable way to start casting cards from Exile, you can just tap all of your wolves to help pay for the cost of these spells, and whenever you cast them you will just generate new Wolf tokens, which in turn you can tap to just continue and storming off with your spells from Exile, because you can even use creatures to convoke out spells even if they have summoning sickness. And another really cool thing is that the wolves that Faldorn generates for us are actually green creatures, so we can even tap them to help pay for the green mana pips in any sort of spell we cast. Now while just that effect alone would already be more than enough reason to include this lizard wizard in the deck, it also comes with another ability. At the beginning of our first main phase we get the option to discard a card, and whenever we do so we get to exile the top 2 cards of our library. Then we get to pick one out of those 2 cards and we get the option to play it straight from exile until the end of turn. So not only will this card make it really easy to cast all of our spells for barely any mana from exile, it's also an exile enabler by itself, just giving us some passive card advantage and making sure we always have fodder in exile we can play. Torgal, a fine hound, a 2-mana wolf we can tap to add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool, which by itself is already some pretty okay value, but where this thing gets absolutely crazy is its passive ability that just fits the theme of this deck perfectly. Because whenever you cast your first human spell in a turn, it will enter the battlefield with an additional amount of +1/+1 counters equal to the total amount of wolves and dogs you control. Yeah, this thing goes absolutely nuts with the huge amount of wolves that Faldorn will generate for us. We are playing a total of 5 humans in the deck, but the most important part is that our commander also has the human typing. So if you had her on the battlefield and you managed to generate a couple of wolves with her and your opponents did remove her, whenever you now recast her from the command zone, she will enter with like 5 to 10 additional counters, just making her into a massive body that will be really hard for your opponents to get off the board. And now that we're on the topic of really unique and impactful 2-drop dorks, we're also playing a Twitching Doll, which is a 2-mana artifact creature that whenever we tap it will add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool and will also put a nest counter on itself. And by tapping and sacrificing Twitching Doll we get to generate a 2/2 spider token with reach for each counter on this card. So you can just drop this early in the game and use it as an acceleration piece and make it stack up counters over the course of the game, and then once you get to the late game you can just crack this little card and it will generate you like 5 spider tokens, which will trigger all of the impact tremor effects and will benefit from all of the stat boosting cards we are playing in this deck that you will see later in the win conditions section. And another really unique thing about this card is that its last ability doesn't actually state the number of nest counters, it will take into account any sort of counter on this card. So once we can start stacking up this creature with additional counters from things like a Germination Practicum, whenever we crack it, it will generate us an entire army of spiders. Cryptolith Rite, a little 2-mana enchantment that will, whenever it is on the battlefield, turn all of our creatures into birds of paradise. Now while obviously we will be generating a huge amount of these wolf tokens, we might as well turn them into additional resources. And this thing can set you up for some really incredible value chains, because once you do have a couple of wolves on the battlefield, no matter how many cards you do exile in a turn, you will always have the resources available to cast all of them, which will generate you even more wolf tokens that will generate you even more mana on the next turn. And the new and sort of improved version of a Cryptolith Rite is an Enduring Vitality, which is a 3-mana enchantment creature with exactly the same passive effect, turning our entire board into mana dorks, but it comes with the benefit that whenever it does get removed, it will just return to the battlefield as an enchantment, essentially forcing your opponents to use 2 removal spells to permanently get rid of this thing. And one of the best things about this card is that its ability will also apply to itself, and you will actually be able to tap your Enduring Vitality as some sort of a mana dork. Woodwork Prodigy, a really weird new card we will get in the Reality Fracture set. It's a 3-mana creature that at the beginning of your upkeep will just keep repairing itself every single turn. And whenever it is prepared for the low cost of 3 mana, you can use its spell part that will essentially generate you a Gruul Signet. And while this thing might seem really slow, it is just the perfect fit for whenever you are going to get into grindier games. Because you can just start generating these hardwood tokens every turn, and on the next turn you can use the mana from the hardwood tokens to activate this card's ability and generate you even more. And the best part is that just like a studious first tier, whenever you activate this ability with Faldorn or any of our Exile payoff engines on the battlefield, it will count as casting a spell from Exile. So not only will you be generating an additional mana rock every turn, you will also get an additional wolf and a trigger out of any of our Exile payoffs. Interdimensional Webwatch, one of the most potent cards we got in the Spider-Man set for any sort of Exile deck. At its base, it's a 4 mana rock that will tap for 2 mana of any color, but you can only use that to cast spells from Exile, which in this deck really is the only thing we care about anyways. But the best thing about this card is that whenever it enters a battlefield, it will allow us to impulse draw 2 cards that will be available to play until the end of our next turn. So you can just play this card, get 2 cards into Exile, and by the time you get to your next turn, you can just tap this card to help pay for the cards that this thing exiled, which always feels really great to do in this deck. Savvy Trader, a 4 mana dude with a hat that will reduce the cost of any spell we cast from Exile by 1 generic mana, which just like a Goblin Anarchist will make it really easy to just start chaining spells from Exile, because its cost reduction will apply to any spell we do impulse draw. And while it might seem a little less efficient because it costs double the mana and doesn't apply to all of the cards you have in your hand, it does come with an additional effect. Whenever it enters the battlefield, you get to pick 1 permanent card in your graveyard and exile it, and for as long as that card remains in exile, you get the ability to cast it, giving us a really solid recursion tool that we can use on any valuable permanent we lost over the course of the game. We will even get a small little discount on casting it for as long as this creature remains on the battlefield, and even if you don't have any relevant permanents in your graveyard, you can usually target a Fabled Passage or a fetch land and use this thing as some sort of an acceleration tool. Xenagos the Reveler, one of my personal favorite Planeswalker cards because he did release back when I just started getting into Magic. And to this day, this card just remains an absolute powerhouse. His +1 loyalty ability will allow you to add a mix of red and green mana to your mana pool equal to the total amount of creatures you control. And I don't think I have to explain how crazy this ability can get in a deck like this, where we will be generating a huge amount of wolves and we will always have a bunch of mana dorks on the battlefield. Usually whenever you activate this, it will generate you anywhere between 4 to 8 mana, which is some pretty solid value, while a 0 ability will generate you a 2/2 Satyr token with haste, which first up will give us an extra body to generate additional mana by using Xenagos' first ability. We can use all of our creature buffing tools and our Impact Tremors cards to get additional value out of the Satyrs, and the best Planeswalkers are always the ones that can generate their own blockers to protect themselves, just making sure that whenever you do resolve an early Xenagos, you actually have a way to protect him from being swung at by some mana dorks. And the last and the most boring card in the entire section is a Soul Ring. Now I know it's nothing fancy, but it will allow us to have a really explosive start and get 4 drops like Xenagos on the battlefield from as early as turn 2. It gives us a really easy way to pay for the colorless mana in Faldorn's activated ability. If our commander does get removed, it gives us a really easy way to pay for the commander tax, and it will just allow us to cast any of the biggest threats in this deck 2 turns earlier. And even if in the late game you do impulse draw into any of these cheap little acceleration pieces, it's honestly not all that bad, because you will be able to cast them from exile for barely any mana, and you will get an additional wolf out of Faldorn and a trigger of any of our exile payoffs. Now that we did get our mana taken care of, it is time to look at what is the heart of this deck. The cards that actually allow us to cast stuff from exile. Without these cards, our commander is just a simple 3/3 creature that will occasionally make you a wolf. The cards you are about to see are truly the engines that keep this deck running. Laelia, the Blade Reforged, a 3-mana haste creature that whenever it attacks allows us to exile the top card of our library and we get the option to play it until the end of turn, allowing us to dig one card deeper into our deck while also just making sure we have an additional card to play from exile to get a Faldorn trigger every turn. And thanks to this card having haste, it will give you some immediate value whenever it hits the battlefield. Now I will mention this once throughout the entire video. Before you make your land drop for the turn, you do want to get all of your impulse draw effects first. Because if you do exile some actual lands and you already made the land drop, your land will just be stuck in exile and it will be wasted forever and you won't be able to generate an additional wolf with Faldorn. So attack first, see what cards you do hit and then make your land drop. And this creature also comes with the ability that whenever one or more cards are put from your graveyard or your library into exile, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on Laelia, just making her body scale bigger and bigger over the course of the game, and it actually does get kind of ridiculous in this type of deck where we will be doing a ton of exiling. Professional Facebreaker, a classic card played in many red decks for its first ability, that whenever one or more creatures you control do deal combat damage to an opponent will generate you a treasure token. And since in this deck we will always be controlling a huge amount of wolves, it will be really easy to just send them at your opponents and accelerate your mana this way. Just keep in mind that because this card says one or more opponents, if you do send 3 wolves at a single opponent, you will only get to generate 1 treasure token. So usually it's just better to send your wolves around, and whenever you do connect to 3 different opponents, you will actually get to generate 3 treasures instead. Now while most players actually include this card to just accelerate their mana with the treasures, this card also has an activated ability which is just the perfect fit for this deck. By sacrificing a treasure token, we get to exile the top card of our library and we get to play it until the end of turn, allowing us to convert all of those treasures into additional cards from exile we can cast, which will generate us even more wolves that we can swing at our opponents to generate us even more treasures. Valakut Exploration, a 3-mana enchantment that whenever land enters the battlefield under our control will allow us to impulse draw 1 card. Now baseline, this card will give you access to 1 additional card in exile every turn whenever you do make your land drop. But whenever you are able to get additional lands into play by using things like a fetch land, a studious first year, or an exploration, you will get even more value from it. And at the beginning of your end step, if any cards exiled this way do remain in exile, meaning that you didn't play them, you will get to put them into your graveyard, and this enchantment will deal 1 damage to each opponent for each card put in your graveyard this way, which as you will see in a later section is an additional layer of pressure on the burn plan that this deck is already going for, and the cards being put in your graveyard instead of remaining exiled forever is actually a really nice thing, because you will be able to use recursion tools like a Savvy Trader to just cast them again. Light Up the Stage. For 3 mana we get to impulse draw 2 cards that will remain available in exile to cast for the next turn. Now while paying a total of 3 mana for this effect is some pretty mediocre value, it also comes with a spectacle mechanic, meaning that if an opponent did lose life this turn, we get to cast it for just 1 red mana instead, making this into one of the most efficient impulse draw spells in existence. And this requirement is really easy to meet in this deck, because you will see in the win conditions section that we are playing a ton of non-combat table-wide burn cards, or you could even just swing your entire army of wolves at your opponents, and if a single one of them does connect, you will be able to cast this for 1 mana in your second main phase. And a newer card with exactly the same effect is a Crossover Collaboration, also allowing us to impulse draw 2 cards for 3 mana. And the reason I decided to include this card in the deck is because it also comes with a Teamwork 2 mechanic, meaning that whenever we cast a spell, we get to tap any sort of creatures with a total power of 2 or greater, and whenever we do so, this spell will also generate us a treasure token, providing us with additional cards we can cast from exile on the next turn, while also generating us additional resources to help pay for them. Wild Wasteland, a 3 mana enchantment with a pretty crazy line of text. Skip your draw step. And while this obviously is a pretty horrible downside, it does come with a really crazy effect in return for this type of deck. Because at the beginning of our upkeep we get to exile the top 2 cards of our library and we get to play them until the end of turn. And while at times this effect might feel really awkward because we won't have any fuel to discard to Faldorn's ability anymore, and every card we exile this way has some sort of a use it or lose it rule because whenever we don't cast it, it will be stuck in exile forever. Trust me when I tell you, this is by far one of the strongest exile engines in the entire deck because we get this really potent effect for only 3 mana. And talking about exile engines, we're also playing Kate Sit, which is a really weird looking cat with a megaphone that seems like she is working in a casino. And fittingly, this card comes with an ability named Lucky Slots, that at the beginning of combat on our turn will allow us to scry 1 and then exile the top card of our library, and we get the option to play it until the end of turn. Now while paying 4 mana for an effect that will just impulse draw 1 card every turn might seem like a horrible deal, the best thing about this card is actually the scrying, because you'll actually get to look at the top card of your library and decide if you actually want to impulse draw into it. If you for example see that it is a really expensive card and you don't have the mana to pay for it, you can just scry to the bottom and try your luck on the next card, giving us a really solid form of card selection. Chandra, Torch of Defiance, one of the most versatile planeswalkers in existence because she does come with 4 abilities that all have a use. Her first +1 ability will allow us to impulse draw 1, making sure that we get to dig deeper into our deck and get cards to trigger Faldorn with, and if we don't play the card she will even deal 2 damage to each opponent, just giving us an additional layer of pressure. Her second +1 ability will allow you to add 2 red mana to your mana pool, just allowing you to accelerate your mana even further and making sure you do have the resources to cast whatever you exile. Her third -3 ability is a spot removal tool that will deal 4 damage to a specific creature, which is a really good tool to just spot remove any problematic commander on the battlefield. And if you get to her ultimate ability, which in this deck might actually happen because you will have an army of wolves to protect her, you will get an emblem that will deal 5 damage to any target whenever you cast any spell. I can assure you that whenever this happens, the game is basically over. Hux, Grizzly Guardian, a massive 4 mana 5/5 badger warrior that looks like he's crushing some sort of a skeleton of a rat. And whenever we cast him we get the option to invest additional generic mana, and for every point of mana we did invest we get to impulse draw 1 card from the top of our library. And this is just the perfect mana sink for whenever you do have a Xenagos, a Cryptolith Rite or an Enduring Vitality on the battlefield. You'll just be able to tap down all of your wolves, cast Hux for like 10 mana, and you will get a ton of cards in exile available to cast on your next turn. And what truly pushes Hux over the top is that he also comes with a passive exploration effect that will allow you to play an additional land during your turn, giving us some instant acceleration whenever we do cast him with a couple of mana into his X, making sure that no lands we do exile with any sort of impulse drawing go to waste, and creating us a bunch of additional walls whenever we do have Faldorn on the battlefield. Ignite the Future. For 4 mana we get to impulse draw the top 3 cards of our library, and they will remain available to play until the end of the next turn. A card we can just cast as some sort of an investment for the next turn that will just make sure we do have a bunch of extra cards available to us. But the best thing about this card is that it also comes with a flashback mechanic, meaning whenever it is in our graveyard we get to cast it from there for a total of 8 mana, giving us exactly the 3 impulse draw effect, but any card that we did exile this way we get to cast for free if this card was cast from a graveyard. Now while 8 mana might sound like a lot, in this deck with tools like Xenagos, Enduring Vitality and all of our mana dorks, it will be really easy to flashback this card. And once you do so, it will generate you some absolutely crazy value that will give you 3 cast from exile triggers. And if you get really lucky, you will be able to hit some of the biggest threats in this deck and get them into play for absolutely free. Invasion of Kaldheim. a 4-mana battle that whenever it enters will force you to discard your entire hand and you will get to draw that many new cards. Any cards that you discarded to this effect will remain available to play from exile until the end of your next turn. And this ETB effect is just absolutely bonkers in this deck, because not only will it draw you a fresh hand of new cards, on your next turn you will essentially be playing with a second hand being all the cards that you exile to this effect. And since this card is a battle, whenever it does enter you get to give it to one of your opponents and you can actually swing at it as a target. Whenever you then manage to deal 4 damage to this thing, you get to exile this card and you will be able to cast this backside straight from exile, which is an enchantment that will allow you to discard a land on instant speed, and whenever you do so you get to ping 2 damage to any target, and whenever you do so you also get to impulse draw the top card of your deck, giving us a way to convert any land that we don't need in the late game into additional damage, while at the same time allowing us to impulse draw even more cards. And fun fact, whenever you do swing your wolves at this battle and you manage to destroy it, whenever you then decide to cast the backside of this thing for 0 mana, it does count as casting a card from exile and will trigger Faldorn and all of our other effects. Bloodbraid Elf, a 4 mana 3/2 haste creature with the cascade mechanic, meaning that whenever you cast this card before this thing even resolves, you get to exile the top cards of your library until you reveal a non-land card with mana value 3 or less. And then you simply get to cast that card for absolutely free, which does count as casting a card from exile. Now in most decks, Bloodbraid Elf is already an excellent creature because it will always provide you with a bunch of value no matter whatever you cascade into. But especially in this type of deck, whenever you do cascade, you get a trigger out of all of our exile synergy cards and you will get another wolf token out of Faldorn. And especially considering we are such a low curve deck, we do have some fantastic targets to hit with this effect. You can hit some exile engines like a Wild Wasteland or a Valakut Exploration. You can cascade into any sort of acceleration like a Wild Growth, an Enduring Vitality or a Cryptolith Rite. Or you can even hit a Light Up the Stage, which will just make sure you have additional cards to cast from exile on your next turn. Audacious Swap. For 4 mana on instant speed you get to pick any permanent on the battlefield that's not an enchantment, and the owner of that card does have to shuffle it back into their library. Then they have to exile the top card of their library, and if it is a land they get to put it onto the battlefield, and if it is a non-land card they get to cast that spell without paying its mana cost. And you can both use this card defensively as a removal spell for any sort of problematic permanent on the battlefield, or you can use it really offensively on one of your wolves, pull a Hail Mary and hope that the top card of your library is a win condition. And what makes this card absolutely fantastic is that it also comes with a Casualty 2 mechanic. Whenever we cast a spell we get the option to sacrifice any creature with power 2 or greater, and when we do we get to copy it. So whenever you now sacrifice one of your disposable wolf tokens, whenever you cast it you can use it to remove 2 problematic permanents on the battlefield. And my personal favorite way to use it is that whenever you do have 3 wolf tokens on the battlefield you can just cast this card, sacrifice one of them, then target the other 2 wolves, and you will then get to put the top 2 cards from your library into play for free, which can be really crazy if you hit any of our high mana value targets we are playing in this deck. Even if you just hit 2 lands, it does give you some really solid acceleration, and no matter what cards you do hit with this effect, you will just get 2 new wolf tokens of Faldorn anyways. Dragonhawk, Fate's Tempest, and I will just keep repeating this in any video that does have Dragonhawk in it. This is simply the most beautiful card ever printed. Just look at this massive 6-winged bird dragon in all of its glory. Now while obviously just the art on this card is more than enough reason to include it in any red deck that you play, it actually does have a really strong effect, because whenever it enters a battlefield or it attacks you get to exile the top card of your library for each creature you control with power 4 or greater. Then until the end of turn you get the option to play any of those cards straight from exile, and for any card that you didn't play, Dragonhawk will deal 2 damage to each opponent. Now by itself, Dragonhawk will already allow you to impulse draw 1 additional card every single turn because it does come with 5 power. And while this type of high power effect might seem really weird in a deck that's all about generating these small 2/2 wolf tokens, as you will see in the next section we do have a ton of ways to actually make our wolves go to more than 4 power. And whenever that happens, Dragonhawk will just go absolutely crazy. Because let's say you do have a total of 5 creatures with power 5 or greater on the battlefield, whenever you now swing with Dragonhawk, you will get to impulse draw a massive amount of 5 cards, and you can even decide to not cast any of them, and you will get to deal a massive amount of 10 damage to each opponent. Yeah, this thing really is one of my favorite cards. And talking about the massive flying creatures that do have more than 4 power, we're also playing a Bonehorde Dragosaur, which at the beginning of our upkeep will exile the top 2 cards of our library, and if we did exile a land this way, it will generate us a 3/1 dinosaur token, and if we did exile a non-land card, it will generate us a treasure. So not only will this card allow us to dig deeper into our library and acts as a really excellent exile engine, it will even allow us to accelerate our mana with the treasure tokens, or it will allow us to improve our board state with the dinosaur tokens, while on top of that also being a massive 5/5 flying first strike beatstick. One thing to note about this card's effect is even whenever you do exile 2 lands, you only get to generate 1 treasure token, and if you do exile 2 non-land cards, you will only get 1 dinosaur. So the best scenario is actually exiling a land and a non-land, and you will get both of the tokens. Plark and Asari, a 5 mana creature that at the beginning of your upkeep will make each player exile the top card of their library until they hit a non-land card. Then you get to pick one specific opponent who can choose one of the 4 exiled cards. After that has happened, you get to cast up to 2 of the other exiled cards without even paying their mana cost. Now, no matter what things you do hit with this effect, the value will always be fantastic. Because let's say this effect resolves and you hit things like a Farseek, a Brainstorm, a Soul Ring, and then one big threat like an Elesh Norn. Obviously, your opponent will then pick Elesh as the one card you can't cast, but just casting 2 of these small value spells for free actually will generate you a ton of value over the course of the game, especially since this effect will just keep repeating every single turn. And of course, whatever cards you do exile with this effect will give you 2 additional Wolves of Faldorn and 2 additional cast from exile triggers for any of our win conditions. And just imagine you getting really lucky and actually exiling 2 or more big game-ending threats like a Valgavoth, a Jin-Gitaxias, an opponent's Big Itali, or even a Crater Hoof Behemoth. Inspired Tinkering, a 5 mana card that will allow us to impulse draw 3 cards and will also generate us 3 treasure tokens. And this thing is basically the Big Daddy version of a crossover collaboration. It will either give you access to additional cards on this particular turn and some treasures you can use to make sure you can cast those cards immediately, or you can see this as some sort of a big investment that will just make sure you have a ton of cards available on your next turn and a ton of resources to work with. Charred Foyer and Warped Space, a Duskmourn room card that's all about casting from exile. And let's start with the left part of this card that whenever you cast it for 4 mana is just an enchantment that will allow you to impulse draw 1 card at the beginning of your turn. Which I suppose is just some okay value because it will give you access to another exile engine, but where the real magic happens is that whenever you do pay a total of 6 mana to unlock the right side of this room, which once per turn will reduce the cost of the first card you cast from exile to 0 mana. Now, as you can imagine, with all of the impulse drawing we're gonna be doing in this deck, this card will allow you to bypass a huge amount of mana costs. You can get a free Xenagos, a free Plark and Asiri, or even a free Dragonhawk, while at the same time also making sure that none of the cards you have in exile go to waste because you don't have the mana to pay for them. And one of the most recently released and one of the coolest red cards in existence is an Improvisation Capstone, which is a massive 7 mana spell that will make you exile the top cards of your library until you hit a total mana value of 4 or greater. And after that has happened, you get to cast any number of exiled spells this way for absolutely free. And due to the way of how this card is worded, it actually works in a really interesting way. You can either hit some really low mana value cards with this, like a Soul Ring, a Studious First Year, and a Cryptolithrite, and then get to cast all 3 of those cards for absolutely free and generate some wolves with Faldorn. But since this card states 4 or greater, if you actually do hit a Soul Ring first, then one of your 1 mana Dorks, and then a Dragonhawk, you will still get to cast all of those cards for free. So what I'm trying to say is that this card card will give you a lot more value than just a 4 mana hard cap. And this card also comes with the paradigm mechanic, meaning the first time this card does resolve, you get to exile it and you get to cast a copy straight from exile every single one of your upkeeps, which will guarantee you a cast from exile and a Faldorn trigger. And I can guarantee you, if you are able to ram this card out really early, the game is just over, because it will keep generating you an incredible amount of value every single turn. And the last and probably the strongest card in this entire exile deck that everyone knows is Italy, Primal Conqueror, which is a massive 7 mana 7/7 trample body that whenever it enters a battlefield will make each player exile the top cards until they reveal a non-land card, and then you get to cast all 4 of the exiled cards without paying their mana cost. And while this effect does function in a really similar way to Plarg and Asari, Italy is actually a ton better, because it will have an immediate effect whenever it enters a battlefield, and you actually get to cast all 4 of the cards that you hit, giving you 4 cast from exile triggers, which will give you a bunch of wolves from Faldorn. It will generate you a bunch of value if you do hit some small acceleration or removal spells from your opponents. And if you do manage to hit some of your opponent's win cons like a Crater Hoof Behemoth, you just get to cast them for free and it will just instantly win you the game if you do get lucky. Now, since this is such a game-ending card, it does come with quite a hefty price tag. A good budget alternative is a 6 mana version of Italy, which is also a big dinosaur that whenever it attacks will make each player exile the top card of their library, and any sort of non-land card that you hit you get to cast for free. Which is slightly worse because it is an attack trigger and not an enter the battlefield, so you'll have to wait a turn before you get any value. And since it doesn't state that opponents have to keep exiling until they hit a non-land card, you can actually hit some lands with this effect and you won't get as much value. Alright, now that we build up all of our mana resources and have some exile engines on the battlefield, it's finally time to turn all of that value into an actual game win. These cards will allow us to buff up our wolves to ridiculous amounts so we can just go for a combat damage win. We have a bunch of impact tremors effects that will deal damage to each opponent whenever we do create one of these wolf tokens, and some of these cards even generate value by themselves whenever we cast anything from exile, even without having Faldorn on the battlefield. Passionate Archaeologist, a 2 mana enchantment background that will give our commander an additional line of text. Whenever you cast any spell from exile, this creature will deal damage to target opponent equal to the mana value of the spell you just cast. And this thing will just generate you absurd amounts of damage over the course of the game for just doing what this deck wants to do anyways, because we will be casting most of our cards straight from exile. Especially later in the game, once you do have a ton of mana available with all of our acceleration tools and a bunch of exile engines on the battlefield, your Faldorn will now just turn into a sniper rifle, just sniping down the life totals of all of your opponents. Now, since this card is by far the best win condition for any sort of cast from exile deck because it only costs you 2 mana, it will cost you a bunch of money. A good budget alternative for this card is a Flaming Tyrannosaurus, which is a massive 7 mana creature that whenever you cast any spell from exile will allow you to ping 3 damage to any target, and it will get a +1/+1 counter, giving you access to a really solid removal tool that you can also use to ping down your opponent's life totals, and whenever this creature does die, it will deal damage equal to its power to each opponent. So either they leave this on the battlefield and it will generate you a ton of value, or they do decide to remove it and any opponent will lose a huge chunk of their life total. Unstable Amulet, a 2 mana artifact that whenever it enters a battlefield will give you 2 energy, and passively whenever you cast any spell from anywhere other than your hand, it will deal 1 damage to each opponent, giving us another really solid slow burn effect that will just put a ton of pressure onto our opponents over the course of the game, and also stacking perfectly with all of the other cards you're about to see in this section. And by tapping this artifact and paying the 2 energy that it generated, we get to exile the top card of our library and we get the option to play it straight from exile for the rest of the game. Alright, now let's get into the ways to buff up all of the wolf tokens that we'll be generating. Beastmaster Ascension. A 3-mana enchantment that whenever any of your creatures does attack will get a quest counter. And once this thing has 7 or more quest counters, all of your creatures will get a massive +5/+5 stat boost. Yeah, you won't just be generating these cute 2/2 wolves anymore, instead they will now be ferocious massive 7/7 bodies. Even if you only control a low amount of 5 wolf creatures, that's already 35 power on the battlefield thanks to this enchantment. And now let's just rewind and go back to Dragonhawk, because just imagine swinging with that thing and a Beastmaster Ascension and a couple of wolves. You will be impulse drawing like 5 to 10 cards, and even if you don't cast the cards, you will just take all of your opponents out with the trigger of Dragonhawk's ability. And honestly, my favorite thing about Beastmaster Ascension is that you do have a ton of time to get it online. You can just swing with like 1 or 2 wolves every single turn, just slowly creeping up the quest counters, and eventually it will come online and your opponents will have to deal with it. Tribute to the World 3. For 3 green mana pips, you get an enchantment that whenever any creature enters the battlefield will check if its power is 3 or greater. If it's not, you get to put 2 +1/+1 counters onto the specific creature that entered the battlefield, making all of our wolves enter as 4/4 creature bodies. And if its power is greater than 3, this enchantment will just straight up draw you a card, which will provide us with an additional stream of card draw whenever we play any of our big creatures like in Italy, a Dragonhawk or a Bonehorde Dracosaur. And a good budget alternative for this card is a Sylvan Anthem, which is a 2-mana enchantment that will give all green creatures, including your wolves, a passive +1/+1 stat boost. And whenever any green creature enters the battlefield under your control, you get to scry 1. So whenever you now cast from exile and create a wolf, you get to manipulate the top card of your library, and you do get some card selection in whatever cards you are about to impulse draw next. Champion of the Lambhold. A 3-drop creature that whenever any other creature enters the battlefield under your control will get a +1/+1 counter. And I probably don't have to mention, with all of the wolves we'll be generating, this thing will grow into a massive creature body. Now where this card gets really crazy is its passive ability that will make creatures with power less than Champion of Lambhold's power unable to block any creature you control. Pause the video and read the ability again. This ability doesn't only apply to Champion of Lambhold itself, but it actually applies to all of your creatures. So over the course of the game, this thing will just keep growing bigger and bigger, and it will make your entire board unblockable, making it really easy to swing all of your wolves at an opponent and take them out of the game. Purgferos, God of the Forge, the big daddy of all impact tremor effects. It's a 4-mana indestructible enchantment creature that whenever any other creature enters the battlefield under your control will deal 2 damage to each opponent. You saw us turning wolves into massive threats with Beastmaster Ascension. You saw us turning them into Birds of Paradise with Enduring Vitality and Cryptolith Rite. Purgferos will now just straight up turn any spell we cast from exile with Faldorn on the battlefield into a table-wide burn spell. The amount of pressure that this thing does put on the table is honestly kinda ridiculous, and there's barely any card that can match this kind of impact. And he even comes with an activated ability for 3 mana that will give a fire breathing effect to your entire board, giving everything a +1 power boost. Now as you've seen with all of the acceleration tools that we run in this deck, it will be really easy to activate this like 2-3 times in a turn, just buff up all of your wolves, and it will make it a lot easier to take your opponents out. And probably the best thing about this card is that it does come with the indestructible keyword, making it really hard for your opponents to ever get rid of him. Now if you don't own a Purgferos and you don't want to spend a massive 25 euros on him, you can replace this card with a Molten Gatekeeper, which is a creature that will deal 1 damage to each opponent whenever a creature enters a battlefield, and it also comes with a nerd mechanic, meaning that whenever this is in your graveyard, you get the option to pay just 1 mana, get it on the battlefield with haste, and it will get exiled at the end of turn, actually making this into the perfect card to discard to Faldorn's activated ability that you can just unearth on a later turn whenever you are about to create a bunch of wolves. Nico Minoru, a new staple card for any sort of cast from exile deck we got in the Marvel set. It's a 4-mana creature that whenever we cast any spell from exile will deal 2 damage to each opponent, essentially making it double as efficient as an unstable amulet, just generating us crazy amounts of additional pressure on all of our opponents over the course of the game for just doing what we were about to do anyways. Now, while that effect is the main reason she's included in the deck, she also comes with a really cool activated ability. For 3 mana, tapping Nico and discarding a card, we get to exile the top cards of our library until we hit a non-land card, and then we get to cast it for free. Just use this ability to ditch any sort of acceleration piece or a spare land you don't need anymore, and you will get a spin at the wheel, try your luck and see whatever you hit with this. You can hit some low value cards like an exploration or a soul ring, which will still give you a trigger out of Nico's ability and a free cast from exile, or whenever you do get really lucky and you do hit an Atali with this effect, you get to cheat it into play for absolutely free, which will then also give you its triggered ability, allow you to cast 4 more free spells from exile, and will give you 4 more Nico triggers, dealing a total of 10 damage to each opponent. Now, since this card is from the Marvel Jumpstart set, which does have a really low supply, the price on this thing is really high, and it probably will remain so. If you do want a solid budget option, you can replace this with a Shadow of the Goblin, which is a 2 mana enchantment that whenever you play any card from anywhere other than your hand will deal 1 damage to each opponent. And since this card does state whenever you play, it will even trigger whenever you make your land drop straight from exile. Terror of the Peaks, and this thing is basically a 5 mana flying body with a Warstorm Surge attached to it, because whenever any other creature enters the battlefield under your control, this creature will deal damage equal to that creature's power to any target. So whenever you now start casting from exile, you will be able to start pinging down your opponent's life totals with every wolf that's entering. Because this card does state any target, you can even use it as some sort of removal tool to just get problematic creatures of the battlefield. And this kind of effect also scales incredibly well with all of the high power creatures we are playing, like a Plark and a Siri, a Boneheart Dragosaur and a Dragonhawk. Now, since obviously this card is a stable being used in many red decks, it is quite pricey. A really cool and on-theme budget replacement is Iraxa, Empress of Mars, which just like our commander will generate us a 2/2 creature token body whenever we cast anything from exile, and also comes with the battle cry mechanic, meaning that whenever it attacks, all of our other attacking creatures will get a +1 power boost, which is actually quite nice with the tokens that she generates and all of our wolves. And since we're playing the red Paradigm spell, we're also playing the green one, which weirdly enough is also the perfect fit for what we're trying to do in this deck. For 5 mana, this spell will put 2 +1/+1 counters on each creature we control. And with all of the acceleration we are running, we are able to cast this spell from as early as turn 3, which is where things get absolutely crazy. Because on your first cast, it will just buff up all of your mana dorks, and this effect will then keep repeating every single one of your upkeeps, just buffing up your entire board turn after turn, and your opponent's not having any way to deal with this, giving you another free cast from exile trigger, which will trigger all of the cards in this section and generate you a free Wolf of Faldorn. And since Faldorn will generate you a wolf token on cast, you get to generate the wolf first and then immediately put the counters on it whenever this spell resolves. And my favorite inclusion that I didn't see in any other Faldorn list is a City on Fire, which is a massive 8 mana enchantment that whenever any source you control does deal damage to either an opponent or a permanent they control, will deal triple that amount of damage instead. Now, while 8 mana might seem like a lot, with all of the wolf tokens we'll be generating, you'll usually be able to cast this for barely any mana, and the effect is just insane. Your unstable amulet will now deal 3 damage damage per spell. Nico will ping for 6 damage whenever you cast anything from Exile. Any wolf you generate with Brugferos on the battlefield will now deal 6 stable-wide damage. Whenever you swing with any of your wolves, all of the combat damage they deal will now be tripled. And if you do manage to exile 3 cards with Dragonhawk, it will now deal a massive amount of 18 damage to each opponent. And the last card in this section, and you probably could have guessed it because this is a creature heavy token based list, is a Crater Hoof Behemoth. A classic 8 mana win condition creature with haste that whenever it enters the battlefield will give all creatures you control a +X stat boost and trample, X being the total amount of creatures you control. There is a reason why almost any green deck is playing this dude. You can just build up your army of wolves slowly over the course of the game, then resolve your Crater Hoof and give all of them a massive +10 stat boost and trample, and suddenly you will be able to swing for more than 100 trample damage out of nowhere. Now if you don't want to play a Crater Hoof because it's either really expensive or really boring, you could replace this with a Thunderfoot Ballad, which is a 6 mana creature that for as long as you do control your commander will give all creatures you control a +2 stat boost and trample, giving you a really solid anthem effect while also giving the very important trample keyword, just making sure that your opponents can chum block your wolves with any sort of small tokens. Before we continue, I want to give a massive shout out to all of the YouTube members. All of my videos really are passion projects that do take dozens of hours to brew the decks, cut them down to a final list of 100 cards, and record and edit the videos. It really is thanks to your support I can dedicate this much time into these high quality videos and upload them on a weekly basis. So whether you've been here from the start, from that first Necroloom video, or you just discovered the channel, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. If you'd like to support the channel for yourself and see what projects I'm currently working on weeks before the videos even go live, or you simply just want that awesome Panzer helmet next to your name in the comments on YouTube, you can check out all the possible membership options by clicking the big join button below the video. Next up we have the support section. While these cards didn't really fit into any other category, these cards really make the deck run a lot more smoothly. Whether that's by providing us with additional utility, improving our overall consistency, or just by making all of the cards we already went over even stronger and more impactful. Sensei's Divining Top, a card that has been around as a staple of the Commander format from the very start. It's a 1 mana artifact that by paying 1 generic mana allows you to look at the top 3 cards of your library and rearrange them in any order. And then by tapping the top we get to draw a card and put the top back on top of our library. Now while this card can be included in any sort of deck as an excellent card selection tool, it does have a really crazy synergy with all of the impulse draw effects that we're playing. Now first up, you can use its activated ability to decide what card is on top if you are about to impulse draw something, just making sure that whenever you do go for a Faldorn activation you have something on top you actually do want to cast. But what pushes the synergy of this card over the top is its activated ability whenever you do combine it with impulse drawing, and let me just give you an example. Let's say you have both the top and Faldorn on the battlefield. You can just activate the top to draw a card and put it on top of your library, and whenever you now decide to activate Faldorn you are guaranteed to exile the top from your library, which will basically guarantee you that you are able to cast a card from exile to get a free wolf and any of our other cast from exile triggers for just 1 generic mana. And the really nice thing is that you can then just activate the top again and you can keep repeating this process for as long as you do have ways to keep impulse drawing, just resulting in you being able to generate a huge army of wolves for barely any mana and going absolutely nuts whenever you do have a card like Brugferos or Nico on the battlefield. Now if that sounds a little complex or you don't want to spend the money on a top, you can also replace this card with a Yuba Mask, which whenever any player draws a card will replace that effect by exiling the top card of their library instead, and whatever player that drew the card gets the ability to play that card until the end of turn. Now obviously this will turn the card we draw for the turn into a free impulse draw trigger that does synergize with our cast from Exile strategy, but the best thing about this card is that it is actually a really solid stacks piece. Because let's say you are playing against a control player and they do draw into a counter spell for their turn. Thanks to Uba Mask, that spell will have to be used during their own turn, which they probably won't do, and it really will become some sort of a use it or lose it situation, making it really awkward for all of your opponents to ever cast anything on instant speed, while we don't really have any downsides to this. Finale of Devastation. For 2 green mana plus X, we get to search our library or our graveyard for any creature card with mana value X or less and put it straight onto the battlefield, which is just a fantastic option to recur back any sort of value creature from your graveyard or to go tutor up any sort of win-con creature you need most at the current given board state. Be that either a Pugferos because he does count as a creature while in your deck or your graveyard, a Nico Minoru to just set up some damage exile chains, or even your Crater Hoof Behemoth whenever you do have a bunch of creatures on the battlefield. And whenever you cast a spell with X being 10 or more, all of your creatures will also get a plus X stat boost and haste until the end of turn. And with the huge amount of mana we'll be generating in this deck, this thing functions as an additional win condition just like a Crater Hoof Behemoth. A good budget alternative for this card is a Chord of Calling, which is also an X-cost tutor that doesn't tutor from your graveyard or has the ability to give a massive stat boost to your creatures, but it does come with a Convoke mechanic, making it really easy to just step down all of your wolf and get any of your big threats in the deck. Our Druid's Charm. For 3 green mana we get a very versatile card with 3 really relevant options. The first option will allow us to either go tutor a creature card straight to our hand or any of our utility lands straight to the battlefield. The second option is a fight spell that will allow us to just pinpoint remove any oppressive threat that might be on the battlefield. And whenever you choose the last option, you get to exile either target enchantment or artifact on the battlefield, which is really nice to deal with combo pieces like a Phyrexian Altar or value cards like a Smothering Tide or a Rhystic Study. I can assure you this card will never be dead in your hand, you will always find a use for any of its effects. Birgi, God of Storytelling. A 3 mana creature that whenever we cast any spell will add 1 red mana to our mana pool and it won't empty until the end of turn. And while most decks are playing this card for the front side, which is honestly a really solid acceleration tool, like 80% of the time we will be casting it for its backside. Hornfell, Horn of Bounty, which is a 5 mana artifact with a really simple ability, allowing you to discard a card to exile the top 2 cards of your library that you get to cast until the end of turn. And especially in the late game, this is one of the best impulse draw engines available. Because let's say you do have 3 cards in your hand, you can just ditch all of them and you will be able to dig 6 cards deep, and whenever you do cast from exile, you will get all of your exile synergies. And the coolest thing about this card is that it does have a really crazy synergy when combined with Sensei's Divining Top. You can just activate the top to draw you a card, then you can just discard the card you just drew to Hornfell, exiling the top 2 cards of your library. One of those cards will then be Sensei's Divining Top, which you will be able to cast from exile for just 1 mana, and you will then be able to keep repeating this process for as long as you do have the 1 mana to repeat this cycle, which will give you a huge amount of wolf tokens that will result in a win when you do have Pugferos on the battlefield, or just giving you a bunch of cast from exile triggers that will close out the game with an Unstable Amulet or a Nico Minoru on the battlefield. Oh, and by the way, whenever you do have a Savvy Trader on the battlefield while going through this loop, you will be able to exile your entire deck, because thanks to his cost reduction, you will be able to recast the top from exile for 0 mana. Enduring Courage, the red version of Enduring Vitality, which is also an enchantment creature that whenever it does get removed will just return to the battlefield with all of its effects as an enchantment. But instead of turning our entire board into Birds of Paradise, this thing will give any creature that enter the battlefield this turn a +2 power boost and haste. And this ability really does have a ton of applications in the deck. It will just make sure you can instantly swing with whatever wolf token that you generated this turn, and they will even deal double the damage thanks to the +2 power boost, just giving you access to an additional layer of pressure. Whenever you do have a Cryptolith Rite or an Enduring Vitality on the battlefield, every wolf you now generate, you will instantly be able to tap for mana and just keep the storm turn going. Combine this with your tribute to the world tree and every wolf token will now enter with 4 power and draw you a card. And whenever you have a Dragonhawk on the battlefield, you can just start generating some wolf tokens, and since they have 4 power, Dragonhawk will impulse draw you an additional card for each wolf you generated this turn. Yeah, this really is the goodest of boys. Toski, Bearer of Secrets. A 4 mana 1/1 squirrel that is indestructible, can be countered, has to attack every combat, and whenever any creature you control does deal combat damage to an opponent, it will draw you a card. And our little friend Toski is just the perfect way to convert any sort of combat damage that we'll be dealing with all of our wolf tokens into a huge amount of card draw. Pretty sad we're drawing to our hand and we're not impulse drawing these cards, but I suppose that would be absolutely broken. Now there's also a very similar effect for 1 mana less, and that is Tovolar. And while this might seem a little more mana efficient, just due to the fact that Toski has Indestructible makes it into a better card because your opponents won't ever be able to get rid of it. And the last card in this section is a Wild Magic Sorcerer, which has an ability that's always a huge amount of fun to use in this deck. It simply gives the first spell you cast from Exile the Cascade keyword, which, as you can imagine, no matter what you hit will provide you with some excellent value because any spell you now cast will cast another spell from Exile, always guaranteeing you that you get 2 wolf tokens from Faldorn and 2 triggers from whatever cast from Exile synergy piece we have on the battlefield. You can cast an Enduring Courage and then hit your tribute to the world tree with this, which will guarantee that you will be drawing a ton of cards out of your wolf tokens that you generate. You can just hardcast your Getali and then cascade into your Nico. Nico will then enter the battlefield first, then you get to resolve Itali's trigger and you will be dealing a ton of table-wide damage with all of the things you'll be casting from Exile. Or a funny interaction that happened to me that's honestly quite useless, but I thought it was really cool, is that you can cast a Germination Practicum, then cascade into your Twitching Doll, get a ton of counters on it, and whenever you now crack it, you will generate a gazillion spiders. Next up, we have our protection and interaction. No matter how explosive our own game plan is, we always do need to make sure that we are able to disrupt whatever our opponents are doing on their side of the table. Haywire Might, a 1 mana artifact creature that for 1 green mana we can sacrifice on instant speed to exile either target non-creature artifact or non-creature enchantment, giving us an excellent way to just deal with cards that shut down this deck like a Vexing Bauble or an Eatersorn Cannon. And there's a very good reason why I decided to play this creature over a really good instant speed spell effect like a Collective Resistance. And that is simply because whenever you do impulse draw into a Haywire Might, you can cast it and leave it on the battlefield for whenever you need it. But if you do impulse draw into a Collective Resistance, you have to use it even whenever you don't have any relevant targets on the board, or you'll just lose it in Exile forever. And for that exact reason, we're also playing a Cindervines, which is a 2 mana enchantment that by paying 1 generic mana and sacrificing it will allow you to destroy any sort of problematic artifact or enchantment on the battlefield, just giving you another tool you can cast whenever you impulse draw into it that you can use on a later turn. And a really nice thing about this card is that passively, for as long as it does remain on the battlefield, whenever any opponent casts a non-creature spell, this little enchantment will deal 1 damage to them, just passively whittling down your opponent's life totals and making it way easier to close out the game with our burn effects like a Pugferos, an Unstable Amulet, or a Nico. Lightning Greaves, a 2 mana artifact we can equip to any creature for 0 mana that will give it both haste and shroud. The shroud will make it impossible for your opponents to use spot removal if you do get this hooked up to your commander or any sort of value creature, while the haste will allow you to use Faldorn's ability immediately on the turn that she hits the battlefield, just giving you access to 1 more card in Exile. Oh, and just imagine equipping this pair of boots to our Dragonhawk and getting both the enter the battlefield trigger and the attack trigger in a single turn. And one of the only non-permanent interaction tools we are playing is a Chaos Warp. And that is simply because it does allow us to deal with any sort of target, be it a planeswalker, a land, an enchantment, or a creature. And even whenever you do impulse draw into this effect and there's no problem on the battlefield you have to deal with, you can just use this on one of your own wolves. Then just pray that Lady Luck is smiling on you and that you do get to flip an Atali into play. Delayed Blast Fireball. A 3-mana spell that whenever you cast it will deal 2 damage to each opponent and each creature they control. And this thing also comes with a foretell mechanic, meaning that whenever it is in your hand you can exile it face down by paying 2 generic mana, and then on a later turn you can cast it straight from exile by paying a total of 6 mana, and instead of just dealing 2 damage to everything, it will now deal a massive 5 damage to all of your opponents and wipe their board. Now while obviously just foretelling this card in the early game and then using all of our acceleration in the late game to hardcast it is a really easy thing to do in this deck. But this card is just absolutely nuts whenever you do combine it with impulse drawing. Because let's say you use Faldorn's ability and exile this card from the top. You will then just be able to cast it for its regular mana cost of 3 mana, and due to the way of how this card is worded, because you did cast it from exile, you will get the 5 damage effect, which is absolutely crazy, and by the way, really likely to happen with all of the impulse draw effects we are playing in this deck. Azuri's Predation, a massive 8 mana spell that whenever you cast it will generate you a 4/4 beast token for each creature that your opponents control. Then after that has happened, all of your beasts will fight one creature that your opponents do control, making this thing function as a really solid board wipe. Now there are 2 main reasons why this card is included in the deck. First up, 8 mana isn't really all that hard to achieve in this deck, and this is an excellent board wipe that will even leave behind a couple of creature bodies. And the second and the main reason is that this thing does have an incredible synergy with some of the cards we're playing in this deck. Because if you cast this with a Pugferos on the battlefield and your opponent's controlling 10 creatures, this thing will just straight up win you the game. For each beast token that you generate, you now get to ping 4 damage to any target with your Terror of the Peaks. You will get to draw 1 card of your Tribute to the World tree for each beast token that you generate. And whenever you do have an Enduring Courage on the battlefield, all of these beast tokens will now get 6 power and you will instantly be able to swing with them, which will probably just outright win you the game because they already fought your opponent's blockers and they won't have anything left. And the last card in this section, and honestly a card I do include in any red deck that I build, is a Blasphemous Act, a massive 9 mana spell that will deal 13 damage to each creature on the battlefield, but its cost will be reduced by 1 generic mana for each creature that is on the battlefield. Now while this might seem like a really weird inclusion because we are a creature based deck ourselves, there will sometimes just be situations where your opponents do get ahead on the board and you do need an answer for it. And a Blasphemous Act is just the perfect panic button, because for just a low cost of 1 red mana you do get to reset the entire board. And finally, let's take a look at our mana base. Because this is only a 2-color deck, our land package is incredibly consistent and we do get the ability to include a ton of utility lands. So let's start by going over those. Castle Emberat, a land that will enter the battlefield untapped if you do control a mountain, which in a 2-color deck will always be the case. And by paying 3 mana and tapping this land, we get to give all creatures we control a +1 power boost until the end of turn, which especially in the late game is a really nice utility option to just boost the power of all of our wolves and deal a huge amount of additional combat damage with them. Kori Mountain Monastery, a land that will always enter the battlefield tapped because we don't have the option to play any sort of plains or islands. Now while the land entering tapped might sound pretty horrible with all of the acceleration tools we are playing in this deck, I can guarantee you that's never going to be a problem. And in return it comes with the ability that for 4 mana and tapping this land we get to impulse draw 1 card that will remain available until our next turn, just giving us access to yet another exile engine on something as simple as a land that we will easily be able to activate with all of the mana we'll be generating. And talking about generating mana, we're also playing Gaia's Cradle, Evendo, Waking Heaven, which is the green planet card from the Edge of Eternity set that will enter tapped and thus come with the station mechanic, which just like I mentioned when I was talking about Exploration Broodship, is really easy to get with maximum station counters in this type of deck. Just do your thing and generate a bunch bunch of wolves and you only need 6 total taps to get this thing active. And yeah, just like in the joke, by paying 1 green mana and tapping this card, it is actually a Gaia's Cradle that will give you 1 green mana for each creature you control, which is just as ridiculous as Xenagos' first loyalty ability, and you can use to just cast a bunch of spells from Exile and get the rewards, or you can just use to dump into mana sinks like the next one, a Kasich Wolf Run, which by the way is just the perfect fit for the wolf team of this deck. By paying a red, a green, X mana and tapping this land, we get to give target creature a +X power boost and trample until the end of turn. And while we're not really that type of deck that wants to boost up a single creature's power, as you've seen with things like Evendo and Xenagos, we will be able to generate a bunch of mana, and this thing can just allow you to buff up Faldorn's power and take an opponent out on commander damage. Mossword Bridge and Spine Rock Knoll. Both are lands that will enter the battlefield tapped and do come with a hideaway 4 mechanic, meaning when they enter you get to exile the top 4 cards of your library, then pick one of them, and whenever you do meet the requirements of these cards, you get to cast them from exile for absolutely free. The green land will require you to have a total of 10 power on the battlefield, which honestly is really easy to do with all of our wolves, and the red one can only be activated if an opponent lost 7 or more life this turn, which also is incredibly easy to do. All you need is 1 trigger out of Passionate Archaeologist, just swing at them with all of your wolves, or just ping them a couple of times with your Terror of the Peaks. And once you then do activate the ability of these lands, you do get to cast the exiled card for free, which will trigger all of your exile synergies and generate you a Wolf of Faldorn. And since these cards allow you to look at the top 4 cards of your library, usually you will be able to get one of our biggest spells in the deck, Exiled Nerdies. Just imagine you being able to cast your Itali, your Crater Hoof Behemoth, or your Improvisation Capstone for just 1 mana. Oran Reef the Vastwood, a land we can tap to put a +1/+1 counter on every green creature that entered the battlefield this turn. So whenever you now are going for a really explosive cost from exile turn with Faldorn on the battlefield and you generate like 5 wolf tokens, you can then just tap this land and buff up all of the wolf tokens that you just generated. Scavenger Grounds, for 2 mana, and sacrificing this land we get the option to exile all graveyards. Now, as most of you know, almost any commander deck does rely on using their graveyard in one way or another, and just playing a simple little land with a graveyard hate effect like this one might actually win you some games. If an Addictive player just spent their entire early game milling a huge amount of cards, you can just crack your Scavenger Grounds and they won't be able to reanimate any enchantments. This thing is the absolute nightmare of any sort of reanimation deck, and even if you are playing against any sort of spellslinger list that's playing a couple of flashback spells, you can just crack this card and they won't be able to use them anymore. 3/3 City. Whenever this land enters a battlefield, you have to choose a creature type. And obviously, in this deck, we will always be naming Wolf. And then by paying 2 mana and tapping this land, we get to add 1 mana of a specific color to our mana pool for each creature of the chosen type that we control. You just have to do your thing, cast from exile and generate a bunch of wolves, and this cute little Bloomburrow land will then reward you with a bunch of mana in the mid and late game. The only thing you need is 3 wolves on the battlefield for this thing to go break even, and every additional wolf you have on top of that will just net you more value. And for the regular mana producing lands, we're playing a Tango land, a Command Tower, a Fast land, a Fabled Passage, a Filter land, a Slow land, a Check land, a Bond land, a Shock land, a new Marvel land that I don't know the name of the cycle of, a Verge land, the Gruul Fetch land, and for basics we're playing 6 forests and 5 mountains. And that's it for my take on Faldorn. Dread Wolf Herald. The amount of value that this deck can generate is honestly kinda ridiculous. Every turn you're just gonna be digging really deep into your deck and casting cards from exile, generating a bunch of wolf tokens along the way, and then building towards an explosive finish. If you've been looking for a commander that really rewards smart sequencing, resource management, and will give you something meaningful to do every single turn, I'd really recommend giving Faldorn a try. As always, if you made it all the way to the end of the video, let me know by dropping a wolf emoji in the comments below. Now before I go, I quickly want to mention one more thing. After almost an entire year of uploading one of these in-depth Commander videos every single week, I'm finally packing my bags for my yearly vacation. I'm really looking forward to just take a couple of weeks off to completely recharge and spend some time with my family. So don't worry, I didn't get kidnapped by people that got absolutely destroyed by the decks that I made. There just won't be any uploads for the next 2 or 3 weeks. I honestly think that this break will do me a lot of good and I will come back with a ton of awesome ideas for new commanders for the channel. So thank you all for watching my videos, thanks for the incredible support over the past few years, and thank you for making this channel into what it is today. I will now go pack my bags and I will see you all in a couple of weeks.